Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome you to Ontra's AI in Action series, which explores how private market teams are putting AI to work today and where they should focus next. Today's conversation centers on the area where the pressure is arguably the most acute: private equity, legal, and compliance. The forces are familiar by now. Deal volume is climbing back towards pre-2022 levels. The regulatory surface area is expanding faster than headcount. And AI is no longer a theoretical conversation. Leading firms have already embedded it into their core legal and compliance operations. But for most teams, the question isn't whether to adopt AI, it's really where to focus. In today's sessions, we will explore where AI is delivering real value across deal execution, compliance operations, and governance, and where a team should focus their efforts to deliver the most value. Our panelists work with PE, legal, and compliance teams every day across many firms, and they will share the patterns they're seeing in adoption, governance, and operational impact. Before we get started, let me walk you through our webinar platform. On the right-hand panel, you'll see a survey open. If you haven't had the chance to participate in the survey yet, we'd really appreciate your insights. It will be open for the entire webinar, and you may participate at any time. Also on the right, you will see a resources tab where you can find additional materials, including a downloadable copy of our companion guide, Top 10 AI Use Cases PE, Legal, and Compliance Teams Can't Afford to Ignore. I'd encourage everyone to download it during today's session. It's a comprehensive written reference that pairs with this conversation. You'll also find links to previous webinars in the Resources tab. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A module. We will address as many as we can after the session. And finally, today's session is being recorded. A link to the recording will be available on our website shortly. We'll also be sending links to the recording after the webinar airs so that you can revisit the content or share it with colleagues. So now let's get started. My name is Gui Smolarek de Barros, and I am the head of legal engineering at Ontra. My team, all of us lawyers turned legal engineers, builds and deploys AI-powered legal tech solutions designed for private markets. With me today, I have Christopher Vilhelmsen, managing consultant at Holland Mountain, and Derek Shanahan, senior director at Juniper Square. I'll ask our panelists to now please give us a brief introduction of yourselves and your roles. Let's start, please, with Derek. You're closer to me on the screen.
Awesome. The short straw. So thank you for having me, Guy, and our friends at Ontra. Quick context of where I'm coming from. My name is Derek Shanahan. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I lead partnerships at Juniper Square. So for the uninitiated, Juniper Square is a fund operations partner for over 2,300 private fund GPs. This spans private equity, venture capital, real estate, private credit. And this is a consortium of fund administration, technology and data solutions, managed services, and most relevant for today, practical AI tooling. So a lot of my day-to-day is spent with our clients, with their fund formation teams, with their service providers. And so I'm looking forward to giving a very well diverse overview of what we're seeing across the market. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining. Let me pass it over to Christopher.
Yeah, thanks, Guy, Derek. Nice to be here. I'm based in London, managing consultant at Holland Mountain. We're a specialist advisory firm focused on working with private capital clients. Over the last 8 years, I've specialized in working with lots of different firms and their operations and technology. Recently, real focus on AI use cases, deploying sort of practical examples. So looking forward to discussing that today.
And in good old-fashioned COVID times type of a flashback, I just started speaking on mute. So sorry about that. Let's get started then. I'm very much looking forward to having this discussion. Your backgrounds are absolutely fantastic for the themes that we'll be touching on. And our first big picture theme is where AI is driving value in deal execution, right? So my first question is, when you look across the PE, legal, and operation teams you work with, where you are seeing really AI making an impact? Is it contracting, due diligence, document prep? Where has the adoption really taken off, and what is kind of what are your views of what's really working at the moment? So maybe let's start now with Chris to kind of do a bit of rotation.
Yeah, thank you. I think as you ask that question, the main thing that comes to mind as the number one aspect is the contracting side. So specifically thinking about NDAs and contract reviews, I think this is something where we're seeing real benefits straight away, and the kind of partnership between deal teams and legal and compliance, it's a very tangible benefit. The use cases are improving at a rapid rate, where we're seeing real kind of improvements in quality, in speed. And I think it's now become the norm at most successful PE firms that this is at least part of the journey. So it's no longer an optional part of it to have NDAs sort of go through manual processes, but rather the AI engine is at least the starting point. So I think that's really important.
Nice. Well, I couldn't agree more. As you know, Ontra's one of Ontra's core offerings is precisely automating and outsourcing NDA solutions. So yeah, that's definitely something we're seeing in the ground as well, and perhaps even expanding into other workflows. Derek, really curious to hear from you, as of course Juniper Square has a very broad suite of products, right? And touches into kind of all sorts of areas, including beyond legal. So really interested to hear your thoughts.
There's a lot going on right now. And just to add a note on Christopher's point, contract automation across anything that is high volume and routine, those are the characteristics that I would draw. Anything that's super complex or requires counsel direct feedback, there's some balance, and there's an expert in the loop function to be spoken about. I think the other one that's interesting and a crossover is just diligence on data rooms. And the reason I say that is foundationally, whether you're talking about a CRM, whether you're talking about a side letter platform, whether you're talking about a data room, when the data is structured, you can compress weeks of work into days or hours. And if you think about a GP that has 200 documents for a fund, you have a combination of PPMs, audited financials, you have side letters, sub-agreements. The traditional weeks of manual work that had to be done are no longer. If you have a well-structured data room, which is relevant to fundraising and deal sourcing, if the same 200 docs are inconsistently named and poorly organized, AI will process these. They'll do it faster, but you'll get garbage in, garbage out. So far less reliable, you'll have hallucinations. So I think just there, and I'll continue with this through line of data quality, having a consistent data schema, whether it's in the data room, whether it's in digital subscriptions or a CRM or any other tool, is super important. And the other one that I think is related, because fund administration crosses over into compliance and investor services quite a bit. You think about the notion of pattern-based validation. And what I mean by that is firms like Ontra, firms like Juniper Square are training their models to be prescriptive on private markets, hundreds of checks per document that speak to a data schema that is for a private fund GP. Those same principles extend across compliance, investor services, treasury. And so where I think on the contrary, we might get into this in a minute, AI is falling a little bit short right now, has to do with deal sourcing and portfolio benchmarking. And we can talk a little bit about that if you'd like, but I feel as though operational alpha is far exceeding value relative to its friends in deal sourcing and underwriting at this point.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and actually covers essentially a question that I had here on my list as well, which was a little bit of kind of what's still to be developed and not working that well, right? Because at the end of the day, it's to both of your points, right? There is so much going on that the bottleneck for customers, or at least that's my view, anyways, has really become focus, right? Navigating all of that, figuring out what's working well, where you can find that alpha, or where it's kind of more smoke and mirrors than an actual kind of value add, which I guess is probably a decent enough segue into my follow-up question, which is what are you seeing not all clients are the same, right? What are you seeing in terms of the differentiation between the firms that are sort of prepared for that transformation and can really drive, from pilot to adoption relatively quickly, vis-a-vis the other firms that may be struggling and be a little bit blocked there? Are you seeing any patterns in this side of adoption?
Sure, I can start if that's okay. I think near and dear to our heart, and obviously Ontra and others in the space, and I know Christopher would agree with me, not to put words in your mouth, is the data foundation first. And what we see when we get into a room with GPs and even service providers is that pilots are stalling because you're pointing AI at fragmented data across spreadsheets that have version control disaster. You have email, you have 10 systems that don't interact or relate to one another as a system of record. And the other differentiator there, just like to think about first principles, is workflow redesign versus workflow overlay. And what I mean by that, just as a concept, is if you redesign everything with AI as the core actor, you're going to succeed. However, and you think about this as like rebuilding the factory completely, as opposed to trying to take electric and throw it on top of a steam factory. That doesn't work. So the firms that are stuck drop AI on top of an existing process with messy data, and they were surprised for whatever reason when nothing gets faster. I also think this plays into the limitations of AI when it comes to things like deal sourcing. There are deal teams that are doing their best to, as I mentioned before, conduct benchmarking, conduct due diligence. But if everybody's pointing their same AI tooling at the same public record, then there is zero alpha to be had. And one could argue that that might create better efficiency. So sure, there's upside. And so the data connectivity issue is very real when it comes to underwriting and sourcing, but it's very much in practice and hardly theoretical when it comes to, I have a good data foundation, I'm going to use this as a base by which I track my LPs and how I run my shop more efficiently.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I don't disagree with any of that. I think especially the data foundation point, that's the number one thing we start with is the right data coming in, and are you leveraging and pointing your AI tools at the right sources? And I think that's the thing that a lot of people do forget. And maybe just to add to that as well is probably the people side for me. I think it's probably twofold. One is the sort of senior stakeholders. Do you have the right people involved, the right champions? Are they having the right conversations with individuals in the team? It's probably the same across lots of different digital transformation projects, and AI is not sort of irrelevant to that as well. So I think it's thinking about how do you push the messaging, how do you champion these projects? And I think one of the key issues we're seeing with AI tools is also the sort of siloed efforts. So what one person might be doing is really successful, but someone else is trying really hard and spending a lot of time trying to get to that same point. So bring those conversations together, have the right senior stakeholders shouting and championing these projects, and then I think that will then help you sort of get to the right end goal.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with everything you both said. I feel like we see this almost every day, right? Especially on the data foundation aspect. That's also a little bit where kind of I would add to all of that. I would add that there is kind of also the willingness component, right? Going back to Derek's analogy on the factory, there will be people who are already rebuilding the system and have already turned the page on this. However, there is also, I guess, a category of customers that are not there yet, but are ready kind of psychologically, if you will, kind of organizationally to make the pivot. And that's where kind of the data foundation turns from being, a little bit of a tough nut to crack into an opportunity, right? How to navigate building that data foundation in an efficient and solid way, which is oftentimes a combination of AI and people and all of that intersection, right? But yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's and I really like the factory analogy. I don't know, we may or may not have read the same book on this. There's a pretty good book called Power and Prediction, by the way, that I couldn't recommend more for people who are in the business of rethinking AI as a system, right? It's just so much more powerful if you can build stuff around the new tooling and what works and what not, as opposed to trying to make your old ways fit into the new tooling. So yeah, look, super interesting discussion. I am taking a look here at the clock. So I suppose it's time to move to our second theme here, which is essentially compliance and how you manage compliance and all the complexity that comes with it with AI. So my first question to you is, compliance teams have been quietly absorbing this gigantic volume of workflows and regulatory requirements and all of that. And none of this is going away, quite on the contrary, right? Regulatory regimes typically get more complex as time progresses. So across the firms you work with, in the compliance regulatory space, where is AI actually moving the needle on alleviating that sort of workload? And where are things still a little bit more on the aspirational side? And yeah, please, Derek.
Sure. Yeah, I love this topic. Talked about it a lot over the last few weeks with both lawyers and clients. I think I'll speak on where it's moving the needle first, and then I'll kind of go back into the aspirational side, or perhaps where there should not be applied AI. Side letters. I mean, obviously, Ontra is a fantastic solution for side letters. So ingestion and tagging. A lot of the fund managers out there, they used to spend months in this compendium exercise, and it's now weeks or days. If you think about the growing complexity of side letter management, you think about PFAR, for example, that technically got sunsetted or delayed or for the 12th time. That didn't change the expectations of LPs. And in fact, it only kind of raised the high watermark on what they expect. And so alongside that, you have the complexity of MFN, and that has not gone away. It's only gotten more and more complicated. So that is a matter of data and organization and having a platform to be able to use as a single source of truth. And I think that's rightfully applied in AI right now, and it's getting massive efficiency gains from AI. Another one is obligation surfacing. So, for example, what am I required to report to CalPERS in the next 30 days? That used to take a paralegal at a law firm 1 to 2 business days, and now it can take seconds, which is great, and it's a good LP experience. On the flip side, I think anything where I would draw the line is anything that has regulator exposure. And what I mean by that is it's okay to use AI tooling for marketing rule substantiation, to run checks with deterministic models to make sure to the 10th decimal point that your numbers track with your marketing material. But anything that's filed, so ADVs, Form PFs, it's very sensitive. You don't want to get fines levied. You don't want to have penalties. You don't want bad press. So just be mindful that the expert in the loop application should be very sensitive when it comes to anything that goes out to the regulators.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Derek. And I think those are probably the 2 main points I would want to cover as well, is sort of side letters and LP obligation tracking. And I think it's really all about creating sort of the right environment where you've set up a queryable data set and you can go through and you can be dynamic in the way that you use that data. I think previously, as you said, you're spending hours looking for the right terms, looking for the right details. You can investigate at speed. But then also you come back to the point of being able to audit everything. So if you have an LP that questions something, you're not sort of left fumbling, trying to find the right conversation and the right thread and where you found this information. You can immediately pinpoint this is exactly the point of where we got it from. So it's both from a perspective of kind of speed, efficiency, but actually also quality, because you can ensure that there is that kind of base level check that everything you're doing as a team is correct. It's verified. It's still, as you said, Derek, expert in the loop at any stage, but you're getting sort of the both sides of the coin in terms of the check and the validation. And on the aspirational side, I'd also add, we're seeing conversations where firms are asking, can we be completely automated our compliance monitoring over time? Can we kind of take everything and inputs from different systems and monitor constantly and ensure we're 100% compliant? And it's just not possible with the inputs and the outputs just yet. It's still important that you have the right sort of interactions and the humans kind of acting on it. So I think that's probably the main point that's aspirational. It's not all about sort of automating every step, but it's about keeping things more efficient and removing those sort of highly repetitive, low value tasks.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, as you know, right, we do have our tool Wingsight that essentially handles LPA inside ladder management and digital MFNs, right? And the human in the loop aspect is so, and we are also evaluating all sorts of regulatory possibilities, which of course, whenever you have to file something, that kind of obviously kind of heightens the bar. But in any case, one thing that I've, at least drawing from my experience, it's really a game of where to plug the human expertise, right? Because that's what really bends the curve and makes things really efficient. So there is a little bit, in my view, of especially after the new releases from Claude and all of that, I feel like there was a hype for a few weeks along the lines of like, okay, I can just prompt this thing with 2 sentences and it does everything perfectly. And that's just not the reality, right? Because of the data foundation aspects, because of the tool getting lost in translation, because of the gigantic context windows of millions and millions of pages of documents, depending on the size of your fund. And that's really where kind of, if I had to summarize that kind of debacle in a sentence, is like, okay, it's to Chris's points and to your point as well, Derek. It's about getting really efficient and getting rid of the stuff that is repetitive and automatable. But to do that well, you'll have to have a very good expert early on in the stages, and also doing smart verification points so that you can both capture the efficiency gains of the entire system, and you can do that in a safe way, right? Picking an example from the legal world that has nothing to do necessarily with what we're doing, we all saw that one of the largest and most reputable law firms in the world not long ago had a problem in a court fighting, right? So that's really what everybody is protecting against. And Derek, to your point, that's where knowing where to layer AI features and knowing where to layer deterministic features and making sure that you have that the right human doing the right check at the right point is so important, right? And the most regulated the space, the more important that is, right? And moving on to talk specifically about some other compliance workflows. If you had to point to one compliance workflow that is still being done manually by most PE firms, but doesn't really need to, does any kind of particular workflow comes to mind? Or put it differently, what's kind of, what's next on the wish list, I guess?
Sure, I can start. Two of them, one of which I might sound hypocritical, but the marketing rule substantiation. The reason why I said this is you can use tooling to get to a point of quality control, and humans are now moving further up the abstraction stack. So all of the grunt work that went into proving out performance and ticking and tying, that should be automated. And there shouldn't be a hesitancy to do that at this point. The fact of the matter is there still should be a compliance officer or an expert checking that logic, regardless of whether it's to the first or 10th decimal point, just as to kind of go back on my own, and again, the through line. The other of which is running compliance and KYC AML on two things. One, from the LP's perspective, running it on the entity in which you're investing. And two, from the GP's perspective, running it on which the LP that wants to be an allocator in your fund. And a lot of the tools that existed over the years, think about like a LexisNexis or these core repositories, and you're looking at hundreds of sanction lists. The reality of it is a lot of that can be run in real time now, regardless of the use case. And you should be running exception handling, and you should be looking for flags, and you should be training your platform and your product that you're buying on the nuances of your own fund, cross jurisdictions, you name it, right? And so I think AML KYC in that version of compliance is a very good spot to be in. And I know Ontra has a great platform for that. Juniper has different solutions on AML. And so the reality of it is that should be handled, but you should, again, still have somebody spot checking before you make final judgment on letting an LP in or investing in a fund and so on and so forth.
Yeah, maybe an interesting one to add to that is sort of also think about most firms know sort of they've got their known obligations and they know sort of how to query them, to look at them and to investigate with AI tools. That's sort of the known quantity, but actually being more proactive in asking the question of what is an obligation gap that we might have in future? What is the sort of scenario that might bring about sort of maybe perhaps a new fund structure or a new LP commitment? Where might we foresee issues in the future that we can proactively work towards now? So I think a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of what AI has been used for in this use case is looking back at what we currently have. But I think the interesting thing would be to let's think about the future. What else is there, or a new market or new jurisdiction, or what's potentially coming up, and starting to work towards it so we can be less reactive when those things come up and actually plan for it ahead of time.
Thank you. Those are very, very interesting takes. On the marketing material side, that feels very kind of I can definitely picture solutions there, right? It's something that people will have. We're gonna get there as an industry, I suppose. Chris, we'd love to hear more from you on kind of specific kind of proactive workflows, right? Because as I understand it, your point is about a little bit, being proactive and preventing certain things. So let's say defensive compliance, if that makes sense. So what specific workflows do you have in mind there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's probably a few different threads here that could be investigated. So think about things, I mean, new regulations, they come out all the time. We know things are changing, especially in the last 12 to 18 months, the rate at which these regulations are moving are sort of unprecedented to some extent. They aren't always surprises. We know the direction of travel. There are known quantities there already. So starting to pick up on some of those and starting to investigate them, they shouldn't be a surprise that these things are coming out and they're happening. So start to get ahead of it. Ask the questions of your firm. Are you ready for X? Are you ready for Y that might come up? That's the one hand of it. And the other is also thinking about sort of the new fund structures or different scenarios, or what new kind of potential investors are you going to have that might change the dynamic of your obligations, and starting to think about these sorts of things in more detail. Also, really, it's helpful because you can also then start to be more you're better prepared once these conversations come up. So it's not a surprise to you that you have an LP asking for a certain additional obligation. You've already thought about it and you have an answer in house. I think those are the sorts of things we're trying to encourage our clients to think about.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense, and it kind of and it's really something that comes up not necessarily within that framing and with that level of specificity, right? But when I'm sometimes thinking about AI on a first principles basis, right? For a number of obvious reasons, everybody's very focused on just making things more efficient, right? Going faster on what already exists. And I think that you're touching on a point that is so important, and at least I try to remind myself at least every week or so when I'm building stuff, which is that there is a lot of value to be created in, to Derek's point, reinventing the system. But to your point, right, you don't need to reinvent in the system having in mind what is already there, when you can kind of front load and really anticipate things. It just opens so much up in terms of new possibilities, right? So that's thank you. That makes a lot of sense. It's a really, really interesting, really good way to think about this. Let's now talk through a little bit our third theme of the day here, which is essentially internal governance, right? So internal frameworks and portfolio level risk when it comes to AI, which is something that we're kind of already touching on. Just it's the nature of the business at this point, right? To have to think about these things. So across the firms you work with, who actually, what types of firms are seeing that actually has a working AI governance framework right now? Not necessarily I'm not looking for kind of, a written policy necessarily, but like something that has really kind of, made the rounds and has been internalized by the firms, and that is really kind of, operational and being put to work beyond just, your policy that you asked your law firm to draft.
Yeah. I mean, I do have a number of studies on this, and we've been very interested in keeping an eye on these trends. Hopefully they go in the right direction. So some numbers to quote, and I believe this is from a McKinsey study, but I can provide the source after. About 80% of firms use AI tools, which is not terribly surprising. The biggest discrepancy, however, is that only about 25% have a governance framework in place. So that delta is alarming. And if you go a little bit further, the study that I've read noted that about 10% of leaders said they could pass an AI governance audit in 90 days. So if you think about all these competing imperatives, you also have employees that sometimes go rogue, sometimes use AI at a much faster clip than the company is comfortable with, and they don't know what they can send in. There's sensitive customer data. They don't have guardrails in place. There are not physical kind of roadblocks along the way that says you're about to share sensitive information with the public LLM. Are you sure? Like, it's a little messy. And so the question isn't whether to have a policy. It's rather, does the policy you have reflect reality and how your teams are using it on a day-to-day basis? And we can talk more about the kind of the foundation of regulatory framework and then how to patch it as we go along. But those are some of the numbers which aren't great. And I think they can only get better with the clients that we're speaking with and we're helping.
Yeah, I think that's a really good take on it, Derek. And I mean, when you say 80% of firms use AI tools, it's out of those 20% that technically don't, you probably still have individuals who are using their own shadow IT and they've probably got their own licenses and things. So this is an imperative topic. And I think every time we discuss with our clients, we get very different answers. The idea of a governance or policy framework is different. It depends what you're really looking at. So you've got some who think they've got sort of 5 to 10 policies and that's their framework and their processes. But really, you kind of need to go deeper than that. You need to understand these are our data sources across the firm. This is where information is coming from and this is how it's being used. And only once you start to build that out and then start to apply those use cases and the actual sort of end thinking of it, you don't really have a framework in place. So I think those are the types of questions we want to ask in terms of the entire process mapping of start to finish. Do you understand what the AI is actually doing, where it's getting data from, how it's being used? And only at that point do you have something which is actually operational and usable by the firm.
Yeah, these are all great points. I wasn't that familiar with that particular report and those data points. That the gap is, indeed quite something. Sent a few shivers down my spine, I guess. And it's, kind of, converging what you both said, right? It sounds like for this to really land, it's not just the policy, it's not just leadership. It's really a matter of people who are doing the work, understanding not only the framework, but understanding the intersection between the framework and the tooling, right? Otherwise, people will, I guess everybody's running the risk of people going rogue. But if you don't do that, people will go rogue, right? And that's where trouble starts brewing really quickly. So moving on now to a little bit more of kind of, the regulatory landscape of AI aspects of policy and governance, right? The entire regulatory landscape, at least in my view, is it seems to be fragmenting fast, in part because of the US state-by-state drive, in part because, of European regulations sort of leading the way in terms of being more stringent, as it's often the case in several kind of other industries and regulated spaces. So you have Texas regulations, you have Colorado regulations, you have regulations in California and all of that. So how are you seeing different firms approaching this? Are folks trying to kind of, be very prescriptive jurisdiction by jurisdiction? Are firms adopting more of a kind of, all-encompassing approach that controls for the more stringent regulations? What's a little bit the blend that you were seeing in the market with respect to addressing specifically the regulatory side of AI governance?
Sure. As far as the most basic feedback we can give somebody, it's kind of similar to thinking about ILPA and reporting requirements. That's a parallel I would draw for those that are unfamiliar with, cybersecurity protocols and regulations, which are becoming ever more complicated with state-based regulations. And then you have our friends across the pond with their own that are often more stringent. Look, I think the reality of it is, so NIST is a well-known governing body. They have a great framework in place. Then you have things like ISO 42001, and these are different rubrics or frameworks by which you can take it as a baseline, and then you can look to map local requirements on top. So Texas Triga, you mentioned, I think that was live as of January 1st. But a lot of these local regulations will have what's known as a safe harbor clause, I would suppose I would call it. So if you're substantially complying with NIST, for example, then they give you a pass and they say you're close enough to what we would require you to do. Then you have, which I'm less familiar with, and Chris is way better at this than I am, like the EU AI Act, which I believe has pretty hefty fines in the 5 to 10%. I don't know the exact number. That's kicking in soon. But the general rule of thumb is if you're building around the strictest standards that come, and you think about safe harbor provisions, which a lot of states will probably lean back into, that you should be okay. And that's where we're advising firms to go, as opposed to trying to piece things together bottom up, which is somewhat of a disaster to keep up with.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that as well, Derek. I think it's important to kind of think about these different regulations, different rules, and we know each firm isn't having just to comply with one set of regulations. It's these obligations are across the board, and you're having to often sort of dip your toes into each one of them for different reasons. And I like a sort of a point I found recently in terms of the firms that are succeeding aren't building models that respond to each regulatory obligation. They're building systems that respond to any regulation. So the idea is really that you should be able to have a kind of scalable framework that allows you to add on top and as you said, Derek, use sort of the benefits of other setups or other regulations you're already responding to then be able to kind of work and scale with it. And especially I think with the kind of dynamic nature of all of these regulations, we don't see that slowing down. It will continue to be the case. Firms are growing and having to deal with this on a regular basis. It is really important that you're not just sort of looking at your local regulations that exist now, but rather thinking for the future or other jurisdictions, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like in particular the UPA parallel. Another one that comes to mind, and that's probably just kind of, my legal trained mind being put to work, is GDPR, right? Kind of privacy laws in general. And there is an overlap there as well between GDPR and AI regulations and all of that good stuff that should keep lawyers in business for a long time to come, I suppose. Moving on to a related topic on governance, private equity is obviously on the business of buying businesses, right? So one thing that I do wonder is how are folks handling portfolio level AI risk? Are you seeing PE firms in their deal making process starting to assess that sort of AI risk in their due diligence process? Are they monitoring this at a portfolio level? So yeah, curious to hear your thoughts on what you are seeing on that corner of the market, if anything at all at this point.
Yeah, I can add a few things here. I think it depends on the sector in which they're investing. So if it's a healthcare investor, it's a little dicey relative to if you're investing in consumer goods. I think a couple of risks that exist are, number one, underwriting them based on their data governance and what that means for potential downside when it comes to PII or PHI infractions, right? So if you really skip to the end and you stress test a portfolio company to say, if everything hit the fan and they were subject to maximum fines and penalties levied, what would that do for my investment? And that is a consideration when you're coming up with a price and how you negotiate with the firm before you actually go through the transaction. That's one thing. So I would, again, heavily related to the sector in which they're investing. The other thing is on the positive side, a lot of the good private equity firms that are more kind of planting operating partners and taking minority stakes and letting the business still hum. They are trying to build sort of a back office that is consistent across their portfolio companies so that they are deploying their own AI tooling and AI strategies into the portfolio companies as part of that value add service with the investment. So again, they're instilling operational alpha on a portco as opposed to just using it internally. So there's a few things that I would add, but I would say thematically, it depends largely on the sector in which they're investing, and it depends on what the downside risk is of that particular portfolio company.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, the aspect of kind of AI risk at the portfolio level, it's the same as any other risk now. Once you start categorizing and assessing the application to that specific industry or that specific portfolio company, the level of which you go into detail really does depend. But I think, like with any other risk, it's something that needs investigating and planning for and looking into. I think, as Derek said, there's also plenty of opportunity there. It should be seen as a value creation lever, the fact that there is an AI engine that can accelerate certain processes and look at all the sort of potential benefits of that. So I think it probably is twofold, but it's the same as anything else you look at on the portfolio level now. It should be a part of your investigation, your diligence, and the questions you ask of that firm.
Thank you. That I really appreciate the kind of dual track way to think about this, right? Kind of both the risk and the reward, if you will, the promise of AI and how this kind of pans out in the overall deal. Now, looking at my clock here, when a conversation is good, kind of it's really easy to lose track. So let's move on to our final theme, which is essentially bringing it all together, right? So, I guess last big picture topic of discussion is where firms should be focusing now and how to build the case. So, pulling everything that we discussed together, deal execution, compliance, governance, if we are to advise a hypothetical PE legal and compliance team that hasn't done much so far with AI, where do you think they should be focusing on the next 12 months? What would be your advice? I don't know, Chris, wanna take this one first to swap a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think the main things that I've discussed with my colleagues recently in terms of the client engagements we have and the amount of times now we get asked on what is the ROI of a potential AI project. And I think it's a really new question that most PE firms haven't generally asked on their internal operations over the past years. And for that sort of dynamic now, we're thinking about what are the actual tangible benefits we can think of. And I think, as we've mentioned throughout this, the things you're looking for are high repetition, high volume, low risk use cases. Build on that in terms of really kind of tangible benefits in terms of hours saved, dollars saved, better quality. All of those things should feed into it. And once you kind of put all of that together, it should be pretty obvious where your kind of main drivers of potential benefits would come from. So I think it comes back to some of those use cases we've already talked about in terms of whether that's NDA reviews or diligence data room reviews, document creation, whatever it might be. I think it really does come down to, can it be repeated in a really sort of consistent way? Is it going to tangibly reduce the amount of hours, the cost, whatever it might be? And once you come up with all those things, it's actually quite an easy sell in terms of it's an obvious benefit to the firm.
Yeah, well said. I think it's interesting when you think about who's on this call right now. I'm going to speak on generalities, and I think if you really want to zoom in on change management, digital transformation, Holland Mountain's fantastic. They obviously are purpose-built consultants. But I would tell a compliance team the same exact thing I would tell an IR team, a finance team, an HR team. And I break this down by a kind of a 30, 60, 90. And what I would say is the first 30 days is just a data audit. It's all you should be doing. So mapping source data, looking at quality gaps, really stress testing it. And that's like very unsexy, but it's non-negotiable. Then the next 30 days, 30 to 60, automating what you might consider as a high volume, low judgment task on the team's plate, something that drives somebody absolutely crazy and get a measurable baseline of time savings. Then if you zoom out from that one task within a workflow, then you build an end-to-end workflow, and you can just communicate with Claude or GPT or whatever you're using to ask them for their advice on doing so. I think for, a billion-dollar firm with 10 people nowadays, in my personal opinion, can operate with the same operational rigor and service quality of a $10 billion firm for the firms that are doing it correctly. And then you're basically starting very simple. If you start with a grandiose view, you're going to blow yourself up. You're going to get frustrated. So again, starting with a simple task, building it into an automated workflow, rinsing and repeating, and then constantly questioning yourself as to what I should be putting through this process versus what is sensitive, and draw those lines through a framework.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess that my quick follow-up question here as we approach time is, where do you see, what's the most common mistake that you see firms kind of, incurring when navigating that process of kind of, calculating the ROI, seeing what they should be doing?
Yeah, I'll start, and then I'll pass it to Chris to take it home here. Look, there's two main themes. The first of which is building tools or implementing tools before fixing your data. And I don't want to belabor the point, but the data is a mess. So the hallucinations are a real problem in this world, more so than other industries. The second one, and I think this is relevant because you think about vibe coding and internally built systems and solutions. I can build a lifestyle productivity app in about 2 minutes, and there's no risk if I get it wrong because it's directionally okay. I worry that people that are building their own apps and modules without outsourcing to experts and trying to keep up with everything are setting themselves up for failure and risk because of the maintenance involved, which is very hard to do. And you need experts that are, hundreds of engineers and hundreds of people looking at new models. And that's what firms like Ontra, like Juniper Square do. And that's what Holland Mountain would advise on, to tie it all together. So I think the punchline there is trying to build it yourself. It's very tempting that you have a few technical resources. I promise you, as a private fund GP, you're not going to be competing for engineers and product teams that would otherwise go to Anthropic, so don't bother. So partner with purpose-built platforms and trust that they are handling all the scrutiny of ongoing changes in the world, which are at a breakneck speed, is kind of how I would close it out there.
I think actually to add to that, there's sort of an expectation often that every AI use case can be solved by a single input and a single output, which is really not the case. There are many steps in the way in terms of you need to think about the sort of the steps to get from A to B to C to D rather than from 1 to 2. I think it's important to think about that, which does also then involve sort of tools like Ontra and Juniper Square that have tried and tested AI use cases that are built up over time where those processes are happening in the background so that you don't have to build it from scratch and try and iterate it and teach the model. So I think generally there are certain use cases that will work really well in terms of just put it into Claude and get a response, but there are others that you need to really think about in a more strategic way in terms of what is the data that's going into it, what is the process that's sort of getting me to this point that's then getting me to the final point. And they might not necessarily be the same tools or the same steps or skills to get to each of those steps. So it's important to split your use cases and start to investigate that a little bit further and really start to dig into how do you actually get the most out of AI for your specific use case.
I couldn't agree more. It's something that we're experiencing every day, right? Having to have these conversations and essentially kind of explaining to folks that a good initial output is very different from a system that is reliable, right? So yeah, thank you so much. We are almost at time, so I would like to now things are coming to a close. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, and in particular, our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules for this thoughtful discussion. I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. If you haven't already, please download the companion guide, Top 10 AI Use Cases for PE, Legal, and Compliance Teams from the Resources tab. It's the written reference that pairs with everything that we've covered today. So if you'd like to share this webinar with your colleagues, we'll send you a link shortly. This webinar, along with all other webinars, are available on our website. Thanks again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Bye.